Name a space station. Did you just say the International Space Station? I'm not surprised. It's the biggest and longest running space station that's ever existed. In fact, if you were born after October 31st, 2000, you've never known a day where a human wasn't in space, thanks to the ISS. But this video isn't about the ISS, because humans have been in the space station game since the 1960s. Sometimes people never got to live on them. Sometimes people have to do a bunch of repairs so that they can start living on them. And sometimes you get stranded when your coworkers steal your ride home. During the space race, the Americans and Soviets didn't just compete to see who would leave the first boot prints on the moon. They were also both interested in setting up longer-term space bases in Earth orbit. They thought space stations would be perfect for studying the effects of living in space, doing some interesting science, and of course, spying on each other. The first American space station program was called the Manned Orbiting Laboratory, or MOL, and it came to us courtesy of both the US Air Force and an agency called the National Reconnaissance Office. The idea behind MOL was to launch single-use modified Gemini capsules into orbit, with two-man crews who'd stay up there for about a month and take pictures of the Soviets mostly. And in November 1966, MOL had its first successful launch, an uncrewed craft dubbed OPS-0855. For a bit of context, this was just a few months before the infamous Apollo 1 fire. It was also about a year before the original series of Star Trek featured its first space station, which spent part of the episode infested with tribbles. After about 2 months in orbit, OPS-0855 re-entered Earth's atmosphere, and 3 years later, the whole MOL program was canceled, partly due to cost overruns, partly due to the advent of remotely operated spy satellites. Now the capsule lives at the Cape Canaveral Space Force Museum. But technically, OPS-0855 wasn't the only part of its program to go to space. By 1967, 17 military pilots had been recruited for the MOL's own astronaut corps. 6 of them wound up joining NASA and traveling on the space shuttle. Presumably, they did a lot less espionage than they originally trained for. In January 1969, the same year MOL was canceled, the USSR beat the US in yet another space race milestone. 2 Soyuz spacecraft docked together, and cosmonauts moved from one to the other. If that sounds like a relatively minor accomplishment, take a moment to think bigger. Literally. If you want a space station that's bigger than the rockets you use to launch them into space, you'll want a way to connect multiple smaller modules together and get the inhabitants to move between them. Now, the Soviets didn't have the best plan for future space stations right then and there. The cosmonauts in this mission had to go outside one Soyuz to get into the other, which is something folks on the ISS definitely don't have to worry about. But after a couple years of cooking, the USSR delivered the first occupied space station, courtesy of the Salyut program. Actually, there were 2 programs, the civilian Salyut space stations and the Almaz space stations that looked very similar and were billed as Salyuts, but were actually military operations. So when Salyut 1 launched in April 1971, it was officially a civilian mission and contained telescopes and science experiments. But it'd be a pretty safe bet they were doing what the MOL program had also been planning in secret, just, on the other guys. Unfortunately for Salyut, things got off to a very rocky start. The first space station had to launch before its crew, and when that crew arrived 4 days later, they couldn't get in. So they turned around and went home. 2 months and 1 frantic redesign of the docking mechanism later, the next crew successfully entered the station. One cosmonaut celebrated his birthday. They watered plants. Everything seemed to be going great. Even a small electrical fire halfway through their stay wasn't enough to call it quits. And as the first humans to occupy a space station, they accomplished a lot of firsts. Unfortunately, that includes the worst possible first: the first deaths in space, because all 3 men perished inside their Soyuz craft on the journey back to Earth. Inquests after the fact chalked it up to a bad pressure relief valve that broke and vented out all their air. And at the time, wearing pressurized suits wasn't mandatory, so they had no backup plan. They were dead within minutes, long before their capsule re-entered the atmosphere. So Salyut 1 had no more visitors. But on top of requiring future crews to wear those suits on all trips to and from space, the USSR rolled out even more Salyut stations, including 2 successful military stations codenamed Salyut 3 and Salyut 5. Then came Salyut 6 in 1977. This was the first real long-term space station. It stayed up for 4 years, and 17 different Soyuz missions visited it. But that pales in comparison to Salyut 7, which racked up 9 years of service. It was pretty much the crown jewel of the program. And while plenty of interesting stuff happened on Salyut 7, here's one particularly exciting nugget. In 1985, the station found itself unoccupied for a few months, and it lost power. Not only that, its backup radio transmitter went dark, meaning there was no more communicating with it from the ground. So in what might be the most Herculean feat of cosmonautery ever recorded, a 2-man team spent 4 months training and then went up to fix it. The first problem they had to tackle was the fact that the station had started to spin, meaning in order to dock, they needed to match the spin with their own spacecraft manually. The automated systems they would normally use were no good there. Miraculously, they managed to latch on, but once they opened the hatch, they found the internal temperature of the station had plummeted. They described it as Kalatun, which roughly translates to freaking cold. They had good reason to believe it might be cold because they knew it hadn't been powered for months. Also, there was a whole planet blocking the sun for a good chunk of each orbit, preventing things from staying warm on their own. So it was a good thing they came prepared. They put on wool hats and winter coats and got to work. One of the first things they did was use the thrusters on their docked Soyuz spacecraft to move Salyut's solar panels back into a position where they could absorb a bunch of sunlight and start charging the batteries. Then, carefully and methodically, they went through the station's individual modules and revived it. The cold had damaged some of the equipment, so some of the fixes required a little bit of ingenuity, like when the water in the tanks froze, the water heater broke. So to heat up fluids, they resorted to using a floodlight meant for filming TV clips. It took 10 days for these 2 men to revive the station, but it was worth it because Salyut 7 continued to serve as a space base for another 6 years. From space tragedy to heroic station rescues, and even, allegedly, the first gun fired in space, the Salyut program had it all. But before we get to our next space station, we've got to keep everything running in our definitely not a space station. So here's an ad.
Thanks to JUMP for supporting this SciShow video. JUMP is a statistical analysis software that makes powerful analytics quick and accessible. When you have a bunch of engineering data, you need to choose the best model for that data. This requires actively evaluating, validating, and comparing a variety of choices, and JUMP facilitates that process. JUMP's model screening platform lets you launch multiple models at once and evaluate their respective performances without having to go through each one individually. Once you've chosen the right one, JUMP helps you keep measurement bias from interfering with the true data with its measurement systems analysis platform, so you can stick to making decisions based on real conclusions. They also offer a 30-day free trial for anyone, anywhere. You can find it at jmp.com/scishow.
Don't worry, NASA also had plenty of drama with their first space station. It was called Skylab, and it was built from a repurposed segment of a Saturn V rocket, better known as the rocket we used to send people to the moon. Skylab was launched in May 1973. All 3 crewed missions were completed by February 1974, and those crews did all sorts of interesting things, like observe hurricanes from above, take pictures of a huge solar flare, test the effects of space on the human body, and due to a little mishap with some fruit flies, failed to test how spiders spin their webs in microgravity. Did they also spy on the Soviets? I can't say, but I can say the 3rd Skylab crew didn't go on a day-long strike. That somewhat popular myth seems to have started in a New Yorker piece from 1976, despite NASA releasing the mission's communication transcripts, including for the day of the supposed strike, 2 years prior. Did the astronauts complain about being overworked? Yeah. Did they get NASA to ease off thanks to what one of those astronauts called the first sensitivity session in space? Also yeah. No strike necessary. So where's the real drama I mentioned? Back with the first Skylab crew. Because the mere launch of the station had damaged a few of the solar arrays, causing them to jam while trying to unfold. As Salyut 7 would demonstrate years later, those are kind of important to have working correctly. Even worse, Skylab's micrometeorite shield deployed too soon and got ripped off the station. Any future inhabitants were now at risk of getting a hole in the side of their space station. But there was a more immediate problem since no one was currently on board. Skylab started to heat up, because the shield was supposed to shade the station from the intense sunlight. Engineers were worried that the plastic inside would start to melt and release poisonous gases. For context, sunlight heats up the outside of the ISS to about 120 degrees Celsius. Don't worry, it has AC. Skylab 2, the first crewed mission on the scene, arrived 11 days after the station's launch. After maneuvering their Apollo spacecraft into position just a few feet away, one of the astronauts attempted to fix the jammed solar panel by poking it with a 10-foot pole while someone held his legs. It sort of worked, but not enough to free the panel. Eventually, the crew had to dock with Skylab, which took 8 attempts because the electrical systems weren't working properly. They then managed to fix the shade problem by sticking what amounts to an umbrella out a tiny scientific airlock, then expanding it to block the heat from the sun. So we've seen Salyut 7 get too cold and Skylab get too hot. The next one better be just right. In 1986, the USSR launched its newer, bigger version of the Salyut station, Mir. But they still had Salyut 7 up there. Its last crew had been evacuated due to a medical emergency, and they hadn't done everything they were supposed to. What's more, Salyut 7 still had lots of useful, already in space equipment that could be reused if the Soviets could get it to Mir. So after the crew of Soyuz T-15 spent a few weeks on Mir getting used to space, they packed back into their Soyuz capsule, flew over to Salyut 7, gathered up as much instrumentation as they could fit inside with them, and brought it back to the shiny new station. To anyone who's had to slowly move apartments with just a car, this mission might sound like a minor annoyance at best. But this is outer space, so it was an absolute feat of orbital mechanics. Docking with something traveling nearly 30,000 kilometers an hour once is hard. Doing it 3 times between 2 different space stations is ridiculous. 15 years and more than 100 visitors later, not to mention a serious mold infestation, a fire, and the fall of the Soviet Union, Mir was deorbited. By that time, the ISS was already hosting its second crew, Expedition 2. So you might think that makes the ISS the only working space station in Earth orbit right now. But assuming nothing's gone horribly wrong since we wrote this episode, that thought would be wrong. In 2011, China launched the first of its Tiangong space stations. Tiangong 1 burned up in the atmosphere 7 years later after it lost the ability to communicate with the ground. But of those 7 years, it was only occupied for 24 days, across 2012 and 2013. That's because it was mostly a test to confirm China could successfully launch a space station and have all of the critical systems still working once it got to orbit. You know, unlike Skylab. Their second station, Tiangong 2, launched in 2016. It was basically a souped-up version of its predecessor, but it was also only a test. So it lasted a mere 3 years in orbit and was only occupied for one short stint of about 1 month. But finally, there's Tiangong 3, which launched in 2021 and is still up and running. In fact, it's got a bunch of modern conveniences, like a real oven that can cook chicken wings. It's quite a bit smaller than the ISS, with a livable volume of up to 110 cubic meters compared to the ISS's 388. But there are plans to expand it from its current set of 3 modules to 6. And because space really is that dangerous, of course Tiangong 3 has had to deal with its own challenges. Like in November 2025, 3 taikonauts were briefly stranded on board. A new crew, Shenzhou 21, had recently arrived via their Shenzhou spacecraft. And it was now time for Shenzhou 20 to undock their own craft and head home. Luckily, before they actually undocked, someone noticed cracks in one of the windows. It had probably been hit by some kind of debris. But whatever the reason, it was no longer fit to carry the Shenzhou 20 crew. Instead, they commandeered Shenzhou 21's ride and touched ground a mere week behind schedule. The Shenzhou 21 crew was stuck on the station without a viable escape vehicle for about 11 days, while they waited for their space agency to send an emergency backup. That backup came in the form of an uncrewed Shenzhou 22, which was launched packed with fresh supplies and a patch made specifically for for the Shenzhou 20's busted window. Personally, I would have also made a commemorative patch for the crew to sew onto their uniforms, but I am not in charge of a space agency, even though I should be. 2 of the taikonauts took a spacewalk to check out the window more carefully. They wound up applying the patch to the inside of the window. However, no one was going to put their life on the line to see if the patch would hold. On January 19th, 2026, the patched up and unoccupied Shenzhou 20 arrived back on Earth for further analysis. And as of April, when we wrote this episode, the formerly stranded crew of Shenzhou 21 were still on board. Hopefully, their return home was smooth sailing, or whatever you call safely plummeting through the Earth's atmosphere and colliding with Inner Mongolia. If you know anything about space, you know that it's hard to go there, and even harder to stay there. And while the ISS is certainly awesome and deserves a lot of attention, there's been a heck of a lot of crazy stuff that's happened on and also outside other space stations. Or not happened if you're the canceled mole spy base. Sorry, no one got to poke you with a stick or bring you chicken wings.